If you want to lead a security program effectively, well, you've got to understand its architecture, right down to the studs. So in this explainer, we're going to break down the core principles of security governance. We'll start right at the edge, at the perimeter of your organization, and work our way all the way up into the boardroom. Here's how we'll tackle this today. We're going to build this from the ground up. First, we'll look at the anatomy of a boundary. Then we'll move up to governance itself, that top-down mandate. After that, we'll get into managing third-party compliance and the critical role of documentation and the ATO. And to wrap it all up, we'll use a simple castle analogy to make sure everything sticks. All right, let's start with the most fundamental question you can ask. Where does your security truly begin? Think about it. Before you can build any kind of effective defense, you absolutely have to know where your territory starts and where it ends. This simple idea, it's the foundation for everything else we're going to cover. Okay, so let's dive into our first section, the anatomy of a boundary. Because really, understanding security starts with defining that line of defense. That's where your responsibility truly begins. So what is a security boundary? Well, in simple terms, it's just the line where two areas with different security needs meet. You know, the classic example is the boundary between your trusted internal network, your LAN, and the big, untrusted public internet. The key thing to remember is this. As soon as you identify a boundary, you're on the hook. You have to put controls in place to manage whatever's flowing across it. Now, it's really important to get that boundaries aren't just one thing. They exist in two completely different domains. On one hand, you've got physical boundaries. These are the things you can touch, the walls of your office, a fence around a data center, things that are usually tied to legal responsibility. But on the other hand, you have logical boundaries. And these are the tricky ones because they're invisible. They exist at electronic interfaces, between different networks, or even between different classifications of data. Think about a system handling top secret information, sitting right next to one that's only cleared for secret data. That line between them, that's a critical logical boundary. And this leads us to a really crucial strategic point, a kind of golden rule of security investment. As you're mapping out these boundaries and figuring out how to protect them, you always have to remember this. Never, ever deploy a countermeasure that costs more than the asset it's supposed to be protecting. It just doesn't make sense. Boundaries are what help us scope our investments and make sure we're being both effective and, smart with our money. All right, so once we've identified all these boundaries, what's next? Well, they have to be managed. And this can't be some kind of ad hoc, make-it-up-as-you-go process. It demands a clear top-down mandate. And that, right there, is where we get into security governance. So security governance, what is it really? It's the collection of practices, the formal framework that's used to support, define, and direct all of an organization's security efforts. And in a large enterprise, this is critical. This job can't just live with the IT department, no way. It's best handled at a higher level, by a board or a dedicated committee, somewhere you can get a mix of experience to guide the security posture for the entire organization. And here's the key takeaway, especially if you're in management, you have to see security as a business operations issue, not just some IT concern. And that framing is very deliberate. It's all about elevating security out of the server room, It's not just a technical problem anymore. It's a core business function that impacts everything, growth, resiliency, you name it. Let's be honest. Without some kind of structure, security can be, a bewilderingly messy activity. It's just too complex. That's why organizations turn to established frameworks to bring some order to the chaos. Think of them as a necessary starting point. Standards from places like NIST, for example, give you a solid, structured foundation to build a governance program that's coherent and, importantly, defensible. Okay, so we've established governance inside our walls. But it doesn't stop there. In today's world, everything is interconnected, right? So you have to extend that same level of oversight to your partners. This is all about securing your entire supply chain. So third-party governance is exactly what it sounds like. It's the system of oversight you use for all your external partners. And this could be anyone, your security guard service, a maintenance contractor who comes in, even a software vendor. The bottom line is they have to comply with your security standards, because if they don't, they're basically opening a door and introducing massive risks and vulnerabilities right into the heart of your organization. So how do you actually verify that a partner is compliant? Well, it's a pretty clear, methodical process. It really boils down to 3 steps.
First, you impose your requirements on them. You tell them exactly what you expect. Second, you exchange documentation. You get their reports, their self-assessments. And third, you go see for yourself. You conduct an on-site assessment to get that firsthand proof that their security is what they say it is.
And that whole exchange of documents brings us nicely to our next section, which is all about documentation and the ATO. And believe it or not, this is about the incredible authority of paperwork. This is where policy gets real. You have to understand, before an auditor even thinks about stepping on site, there's a deep dive into the documentation. You could say it's the real first line of defense. All that paperwork is checked, double-checked, and triple-checked against the standards. And here's the kicker. If the documentation doesn't pass muster, the on-site visit is called off. Why? Because if the paperwork's not right, the chances of the location actually being compliant are practically zero. Now, in a lot of sectors, especially government and military, this whole process leads to something called an authorization to operate, or an ATO. Think of it as the official green light from senior management. It's the formal decision that says, yes, this system can go live, and, maybe even more importantly, we explicitly accept whatever risk is left over.
And let me be perfectly clear about this. The consequence here is absolute. If the documentation fails, the operation stops. Full stop. An ATO can be pulled at any time, and without it, that system is dead in the water. It simply cannot operate. That's how non-negotiable, accurate, and complete documentation really is.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground, right? We've talked about boundaries, governance, third parties, and documentation. Now, to pull all of these somewhat abstract ideas together, let's use a simple but really powerful analogy that I think will make it all click. I want you to imagine your organization is a medieval castle. Okay, so your security boundary, that's the castle wall, the moat, the drawbridge, the obvious defenses. No security governance, that's the king and his council. They're the ones deciding the high-level policy, like how many archers they need to hire. What about third-party governance? Well, that's the king making sure the local farmers who bring in the food are actually loyal allies and not spies for the enemy. The documentation review, that's the royal scribe, poring over the castle blueprints to make sure there are no hidden tunnels or weaknesses. And finally, that authorization to operate we talked about, that's the king's royal seal of approval on a decree, giving the official go-ahead for the guards to start their watch. So I'll leave you with this thought. Your organization is a castle, and its safety relies on a unified defense, managed from the very top. So the critical question you have to go back and ask yourself is this: are your blueprints, your documentation, your policies, your procedures, are they accurate? Because if they're not, those castle walls might not be nearly as strong as you think they are.